All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's live webinar titled Value-Based Care, New Demands and Opportunities. Today, we will be discussing the many aspects of value-based care and how it's going to impact pharma, life sciences, and medical device organizations, to be specific. This webinar is sponsored by ShareVault, who provides a secure document sharing solution, which gives life sciences organizations the confidence to simply and securely share confidential information with third parties during fundraising, partnering and licensing, board communication, regulatory, CRO/CMO, and M&A processes. For more information about ShareVault, make sure to visit sharevault.com. Our subject matter expert and presenter today is Scott Whyte, the Chief Strategy Officer for ClearDATA. Scott brings over 25 years of experience serving the nation's largest providers and payers. Prior to joining ClearDATA, he served as the IT Vice President, reporting to the CIO at Dignity Health, the fifth largest hospital system in the nation with annual revenue of over $11 billion. He also founded and served as co-chairman of the HL7 Clinical Genomics Special Interest Group, which is working with an international team of physicians, biopharmaceutical specialists, bioinformatics specialists, and regulators to develop an international data exchange standard for genetic information. You can read more about Scott's accomplishments at cleardata.com. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a quick overview about ClearDATA. Our mission is to save lives by providing healthcare technology solutions that are designed for care and driven by innovation. ClearDATA is the trusted managed cloud provider designed for today's healthcare security needs. We protect sensitive healthcare data with the use of proprietary DevOps automation, compliance and security safeguards, and healthcare expertise. And this is all backed by managed services. ClearDATA was recently named as a strong performer in the Enterprise Health Cloud Wave by Forrester. And according to a recent article by Healthcare IT News, our cloud solution recently ranked in the top 7 alongside AWS, Google, Azure, and many others. With that, I'd like to say thank you to both ShareVault and, of course, Scott Whyte with ClearDATA for designing this compelling discussion for today's webinar. This will be an hour-long webinar. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the session. We will address as many questions as possible, so please feel free to ask questions through the chat window throughout the next hour. We will also be peppering in some polling questions in between, so make sure to look out for those. With that, Scott, I turn the mic over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Christy, and thank you all so much for joining us. Christy, if you could advance to slide 3, please. I'd like us to highlight and be thinking about our personal connections to this topic of value-based care and the life science and medical device industries. It's good to think about this because we actually do likely have these connections, certainly professionally and personally. And as you're considering those and preparing for your questions and points and counterpoints during the discussion, I'd like to share a little bit about my background to seed the discussion. So I'm thankful to have been involved in one of the first accountable care organizations in California. And in that initiative that we published on this topic, had Blue Shield of California and one of the country's largest IPAs, Hill Physicians, along with Dignity Health, come together and try to have disparate, different organizations work to very aggressively reduce costs in the first year in order to serve CalPERS, which is the largest pension organization in the country. And with that example, through emphasis on measures and improved workflow, and really focusing on those most expensive DRGs, for instance, in 2010, for that population of 40,000 CalPERS members, we were able to reduce inpatient admissions by 15%, decrease inpatient days by 15%, have a 50% increase in the long inpatient day stays, those of 20 days or more, and have a half-day reduction of the average patient length of stay with a 15.5 million savings in 1 year. So that is one of those examples that although this was going back now just about 8 years, it was exciting to be a part of that and to see that we can see some improved outcomes and some cost savings. Later, I worked with a Pacific business group on health, and there they have representatives from Boeing and Walmart and McKesson and HP and Intel and Stanford and Target and Tesla and Qualcomm and others who were very concerned with medical device implant costs and the huge variability, particularly with knees and hips, for instance. And we're wondering, for those employers who effectively pay for that medical care, what is the source of that variation? Is it physician preference, or were there truly clinical benefits or cost benefits for one device over another? Very complex effort to start to try to gather information, first of all, before even making any decisions, but emphasis on employer groups thinking about cost and quality. And then later worked on a multi-state initiative for a Medicare shared savings program. So in this instance, we had competing hospital systems come together with independent physicians and enter into an accountable care program of sorts, and worked on one of the early federal Medicare shared savings programs. Huge emphasis on interviewing physicians and trying to understand, what measures could they collect, what measures are clinically significant, and measures that align to the federal priorities and the constraints of the Medicare shared savings program. Very complex program to pull together, trying to get some outcomes measures from many different electronic medical records and different organizations, but it is possible to collaborate. And then on a personal note, I want to share that I think we see healthcare in action where all consumers or patients or family members or friends are. And on a personal note, I have 3 type 1 diabetic children, and we recently upgraded our insurance plan. And with that, we had the demand of our insurance provider to work with a new PBM, a pharmacy benefit manager. And that PBM had a different insulin as the preferred insulin of choice. Our children had been using Novolog for some years, and it's a very demanding disease. So this had to talk with our physician about what would this mean, what adjustments might we have to make. These are supposed to be identical drugs, but there are some subtle differences. And could we appeal this and stay on the other drug? Of course, the PBM is in the business of trying to keep the quality high, but also using volume to negotiate cost discounts with the pharmaceutical companies, in this case, the maker of Humalog, who is Eli Lilly. We worked through that process and did end up switching to Humalog as demanded by the PBM, and I would call this a +3 for Eli Lilly. It worked. They have 3 new Humalog customers. So another example of employer groups and insurance companies and pharmaceutical groups, in this case, working together to try to drive costs out of the system. So in these 3 examples, we've seen a commercial accountable care organization, a business-led effort, a federal effort, and then a personal example. And then most recently, I've been working with life science and medical device companies as part of ClearDATA to look at more international and global solutions that help support value-based care solutions. And very challenging time. And again, I hope that you are able to reflect upon the professional challenges that you have and perhaps even some of the personal connections that you have to value-based care. So I think we all, as health and IT professionals, have an interest, have a passion about making this work, about providing higher access to healthcare, about demonstrating outcomes to healthcare, and then about driving out cost and waste from healthcare. So I hope that sets the stage, and we can move on to the next slide. So in terms of our goals for today, we do want to understand what some of the specific benefits of value-based care are, look at some of the risks and challenges of value-based care and some of the trends that we're seeing, and then also thinking about how do we address those risks, how do we protect sensitive data as it relates to the drivers for value-based care. I think this is a particularly large challenge for the life sciences and medical device industries as we transition from volume-based fee-for-service arrangements to a supply-driven model that is much more patient-focused, much more outcome-focused. And we see this dramatic push to reduce costs while at the same time maintaining the highest levels of product integrity and quality and compliance, along with connecting with consumers and satisfying them and other stakeholders in the healthcare system. So amazing challenges that we are facing, but we do have some tools of technology innovation and even some regulatory enhancements that I think will help us along this path to reach these goals. Let's go to the next slide. I think it's important to, if we can, set the context, or we'll take a little pause here for a quick polling question. So is your organization driving value-based care solutions?
Sorry about that, Scott. All right, everybody, here's your first poll questions. Like Scott just read to you, if you could just let us know, is your organization currently driving value-based care solutions? Go ahead and answer yes or no. We'll give this maybe 10 more seconds. All right, looks like we've got 67% yes, and a little less than that said no. Looks like I missed it. Go ahead, Scott, keep going.
Excellent. Okay, let's go to this slide. It'd be interesting if we could have a dialogue in follow-up to know where you are along the continuum. So, many of us are, some have just barely a toe in the water related to value-based care, and others have ambitious programs that have gone all in. So it'd be interesting to know, and perhaps as we get to some questions later, we can explore that. I think it's important to set the context here of who pays for what. This is specifically, these charts are from CMS.gov, so these are United States statistics, but it's good to follow the money, if you will. If we look at the sponsors of funding on the far left, we see that there are the federal government as the largest, employers secondly, and then households or individuals and families would be third. And then if you look at the middle section, we see a very similar pattern with the same folks in terms of public payment, private insurance, and then we also see this entry of the insurance actor into the scene. But if you take a step back of who are the folks that are putting pressure and demands to drive value-based care, are the folks that we've just mentioned. It would be the federal government, state governments, employers, individuals and families themselves who are now more and more accountable for healthcare costs, and then the insurance companies as well. All have a role in making demands for demonstrated quality and demands for more discrete cost data. And then on the far right, it's important to think about, well, where are the biggest cost drivers in healthcare? And by far and away, you can see over 50% is the combination of hospital care and physician and clinical services. So hospitals, of course, are the most expensive care setting. That is where the highest morbidity, mortality, the sickest people are located in the hospitals with the most complicated diagnoses, and not surprisingly, there's the highest cost consumption there. It's interesting to note that Drugs are listed here at 10%, and depending on how you count it, that's third place, so it's still a significant finish. Then medical devices are not specifically broken out in this CMS chart, but they are about 4% of the costs. So the pharmaceutical, life science, medical device components have a significant target because they are significant expenses for those who sponsor and pay for healthcare. Also, I think it's important for us as an audience. I think most of us are based in the United States. I am, and this data is from the United States. But there is a global movement, and global healthcare spending is $7.6 trillion. And the flow of percentages are not that dissimilar across the globe. The changes would really relate to more percentage of healthcare spend as a portion of GDP, the United States being the highest. Right, why don't we go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So it's also good to think about, how do we reach this point? And I think a lot of folks throw stones at drug companies, medical device companies, for-profit IT companies, and there's all sorts of potential culprits in this healthcare environment as it relates to cost and quality. But I don't think there are really such simple answers. I think most of us would agree that healthcare is a very, very complex environment. The human body itself is complex. If you think about in terms of a bill of material, there are millions of components that come together in a very, very complex system. The goods and the services, the medical devices, the drugs, all of those things, the services, whether those be physician and nursing and other professional care services, radiology tech, on and on and on. It's a very, very complex environment, serving in a complex system. The delivery system, in terms of the number of delivery sites, the geographies, the settings, from retail pharmacies to acute care hospitals, clinic systems, imaging centers. It's a very complex environment, as well as the reimbursement and funding. We've had fee-for-service, and there's been a lot of criticism of that model, but there has been competition in fee-for-service. I think all of us see and live that to a degree. And if we do take a step back, there have been absolutely amazing quality gains. We see a doubling of the lifespan in the past 100 years. So although we would agree that portions of the system are broken and that we should be on a path to continuous improvement, there have been some great benefits over the system that we've had. I have oligopsony is one of the instances where there are a market where there, in a sense, are a small number of buyers. And if you think about the prior slides, when we looked at the federal government combined with the state government, employer groups and individuals, a very small number of buyers in the system, if you will, certainly a small number of buyer categories. And there have been issues in the United States, for instance, about the preferential treatment, tax treatment of employer-sponsored health benefits, and that has led to some lock-in with employees wanting to stay with employers, and all kinds of other complications as we've tried to improve the healthcare delivery system and generate higher quality and reduce cost. There's also been some very, very complex measurements. Much in the past of the measurement has gone to, what are the volume of diagnoses that we're seeing, what are the volume of procedures, and then what are we paying for those things? So those may have been complex when we were implementing them. As we look at those things now, they're completely inadequate for us to truly measure quality and outcomes. So it's really on a more discrete level, it's very, very difficult for us to see quality increases within a population, and cost increases we see on a macro level, but where specifically are the cost drivers, what are the causes for those cost drivers, and expenses very, very complicated to tease out and not well understood. So we've had a very, very challenging system that has caused great pressure to see improvement and much more radical and faster change. All right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So let's come to value-based care and start with the definition. And in simplest terms, across, even outside of healthcare, value is outcomes divided by cost. So in this case, we would see value, ideally in the eyes of a patient or a consumer, the health value that they see, the health outcomes that they see, divided by the cost of the healthcare. And as we saw in the earlier chart from CMS, most of the cost drivers, over 50%, are in hospitals and physicians. So they have seen the highest amount of attention. And in fact, in my introduction, when I shared some of the personal examples of the Medicare Shared Savings Program, the early California Accountable Care Organization, those instances, there was almost no focus on pharmaceutical or medical device areas of cost. Virtually all of the focus was on acute care and then physician expenses and physician-driven expenses. So with attention there, we've seen some cost reductions, but I think many, in terms of the sponsors and the payers of healthcare, have realized that we need to spread out the lens and look for other areas of cost savings. We have seen emphases on areas of chronic disease management like type 2 diabetes and heart disease and congestive heart failure. But beyond that, we realize that we have to focus broadly on all of the cost drivers of care and all of the elements of quality, and that is causing medical devices and life sciences, pharmaceuticals to be drawn into that net and to have additional focus. I would also share that, well, why don't we go to the next slide? So thus far, we've mostly focused on this trend for value-based care in the United States. I think it's important for pharmaceutical and medical device companies to be aware that this is absolutely an international business. We know that because of the extremely high research and development investment that your products demand, you have global distribution in order to recoup those R&D costs. And these value-based care pressures that we're seeing in the United States are taking place absolutely across the world. This ICHOM organization was created by individuals in the United States and Sweden, founded the organization. The goal of this organization is to create standard sets of outcome measures, again, that really matter to patients. They want to drive adoption for these standards and then report worldwide to understand where there are disparities, where there are perhaps some breakthrough and effective means for improving quality and reducing cost. I see this as a benefit to us as part of the healthcare delivery system, in that if we can have reduced or more consistent standards globally, then that reduces our cost to be able to scale value-based care solutions globally. So there's a benefit there. We're seeing, though, greater transparency with the OECD has come together with ICHOM and developed a letter of intent to publish these outcomes for international comparison. So with the gathering of these data, we do see transparency and potential exposure of high-level costs, but also exposure for some good wins and some therapies which are particularly effective and particularly cost-effective with quality. In addition to those organizations, we see the World Economic Forum. This is very recent, in January of 2017, produced a report related to laying the foundation in the healthcare system with value-based care. Again, the co-chairs of this included Novartis, Qualcomm, Medtronic, Kaiser. So we see different elements of the healthcare system, pharmaceutical, communications, medical device, care delivery, and payers coming together from a global perspective to drive value-based care. All right, let's proceed to the next slide, please. And I do want to emphasize, again, that this is happening now. So we have the cost background, we have the demand for quality, we know that this is international, and we have some of you on the phone and your peers are publishing. And we have a note that by 2020, 75% of commercial payments, at least here in the United States, are expected to be through value-based arrangements. So our colleagues are already jumping in. We have this message from Roche, and these are all very recent. Is partnering with Qualcomm for remote patient monitoring. We have PwC producing a very recent report related to medical device makers and diagnostic organizations responding to this demand for value-based care. On the upper right, Philips has published quite a bit on the Health Suite digital platform in order to reduce connectivity costs and provide additional values and measures to respond to value-based care demands globally. Accenture has their life sciences cloud for R&D and has published significantly on running the whole life cycle for pharma medical device from clinical trials all the way to patient outcomes, and how digital tools are necessary to support those types of new innovations. And in fact, in the very bottom here, I think it's quite interesting, and this is from an Accenture report, that 80% of life science executives agree that platform-based business models will become a part of their growth strategy. 80%. So we know that when they say platform, that means we are now information enabling medical devices and pharmaceutical life science therapies. Very, very different. Instead of just developing a specific chemical or biologic, we're now wrapping that with information in order to differentiate and deliver and demonstrate better outcomes. All right, let's go to slide next one, please. So given that backdrop, what are some of the demands I think we have specifically on medical devices? Well, our goals to date for medical devices have rightly been first and foremost clinical safety, and then of course effectiveness, along with having a business case. And that's though being, I would say, enhanced or changed, and I think there are some additional demands. Some of these have existed before. The demand, for instance, for improved workflow, but there's much more demand for this. So hospitals, for instance, have had tremendous pressure on margins. Most hospitals make 5% or less. So it's a very narrow margin business, high capital expenditures, high labor expenditures, and they have tremendous productivity challenges within hospitals. That has only been made worse, or more challenging, I should say, with, for instance, the additional electronic medical record implementations, the meaningful use demands of gathering more and more measures. And many of these measures are not a natural part of the care delivery workflow. And that has caused frustrated some great frustration among providers. They feel like they are, in some cases, over-documenting and they are being over-measured. And now we, from a medical device community, are coming in and say, add this to your workflow and add additional documentation and measurement. So we have to be very, very careful from the conception of the medical device and the design of the medical device, and certainly all the way through the prototyping and testing and implementation and continual improvement of that device to keep the care delivery workflow front and center. So I think that the fact that we're actually putting more demands on an already stressed care delivery system, calls us to really up our game in terms of workflow. Related to that would be this topic of inefficiency. So the first concept would be let's not make the workflow worse. Of course, better would be, can we help make the workflow better? So are there ways that we can provide measurements of workflow efficiency as a byproduct of the medical device work? So whether that's MRI utilization and throughput, for instance, are there ways that we can get some measure, whether that's time of day or diagnoses or whatever variables that there may be, that would help us tease out where there are bottlenecks in the throughput, or where there is some underutilization of a device, for instance. How can we actually contribute to the greater efficiency in the hospital as opposed to just adding burdens to the workflow? These are things that will be absolutely differentiating for medical devices. And some of the examples I've used here are for the acute care setting, but you can see that the themes and the principles would apply to ambulatory care and home care, et cetera, other care settings. Third point would be, of course, we have to gather and report measures. This does require oftentimes some collaboration. Sometimes it's collaboration with different organizations. Almost certainly it is collaborating with different systems. And there are tremendous challenges in terms of even what we might think would be simple things like patient identification and provider identification and terminology and an ontology from a medical language and knowledge representation. These topics actually become quite complex. Plugging in the wires from a networking perspective, typically we can get that done. But the sharing of medical knowledge between different systems that have different goals can be very, very challenging. So this again takes some strong design thinking. The other point here I think that is good is that we as industry professionals don't have to necessarily just take the measures as they are, but we should stand up and influence the development of that measure, those measures. Some of those from a Medicare perspective, for instance, would be influencing in Washington, D.C., in the case of the United States, or influencing the development of measures in the field with your hospital counterparts. There may be measures that are too difficult to obtain, I should say. And there are times where we as professionals who have knowledge should push back and say, you know what, if the clinical goal is this, here's actually a better measure that would be less intrusive to the workflow or the clinician and less expensive for us to gather. So I think it should be a dialogue as opposed to just taking the measures and trying to figure out what they are. The other element of these from a medical device perspective is these systems is the Accenture comment where 80% of the executives are developing platforms. Well, these platforms can become very complex with multiple interfaces, more complex project management, multiple external dependencies, ongoing operating costs. How do we, again, from a design perspective, try to simplify the implementations, make them more fail-safe from a project management perspective, reduce external dependencies and operating costs? That's a tall order for us, given the reporting demands that we have. And then finally, all of these things have to be done quickly. We need to get these systems in quickly, and then once they are in, they need to share information quickly. If a patient is going to be in a provider's office the day after discharge, then measures or information needs to be in that provider's office prior to that clinic visit, so that the physician can make decisions and have an effective conversation with that patient. So their speed is of the essence. Let's go ahead and move to slide 11. We have very similar demands from on the life sciences perspective, and I'm going to move along just on the case of time. You see, of course, we're again focusing on clinical safety and effectiveness, all with a business case. We've been doing that for many years. We've always tried to reduce drug development cost and speed, but the demand for that is ever increasing. Although I think we also have new information-enabled tools and real-world evidence and some big data tools and some in silico ways to model and reduce drug development, but big emphasis there. Medication adherence, of course, in order to drive the clinical outcome. There actually might have an increase in drug consumption, which could be a good thing for the pharma company. Continuing to support care delivery. Similar to the medical device area, we have to have workflow, education, tools, and the first use case that I share will have some information about how information tools can actually support care delivery. Same emphasis on supporting outcomes, and again, this feedback on regulatory support. Being an advocate in a positive way to say, this is how the drug development works, and this is how the care delivery works, and this is what is reasonable from a regulatory perspective, and here are the areas of improvements in approvals, for instance, that we need, while keeping an eye, of course, on patient safety and effectiveness. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. I'll share an example of the pressure, and this is from Forbes very recently. You can see in May that we already have this this pressure. Drug prices, we've seen some areas are increasing, but we see the value-based care is absolutely hitting the pharmaceutical industry. 1 in 4 health plans have at least one outcomes-based contract with a drug maker. 30% of plans are negotiating for 1 or more outcomes contracts now. So this is absolutely happening, likely with many of your organizations. The CEO of Cigna said that we have created 7 such arrangements in the past 2 years that base reimbursement on the efficacy of the drug, not just consumption or the volume of the drug. So that's CEO David Cordani of Cigna. Let's go to the next slide. What is the impact then on the pharmaceutical organizations? Are these pressures really having an impact? And this is an example, and some of these are, you might say these are outliers, but I think the theme is absolutely there. These are drugs where there are really not good substitutes, and these are used in emergency or in ICU situations. There really aren't good direct alternatives. However, following some very high price increases, the use of these 2 cardiac drugs was slashed dramatically in 47 hospitals, according to this research. And in one organization, Ascension, the increase in the cost of these drugs drove nearly $12 million of increased spending at Ascension in 1 year. So even when we think there may be not a substitute for a drug, if the price becomes too high, we do see reduced utilization. So there is absolutely pressure, and it is happening today. Let's go to the next slide and look at some enablers. We have challenges in workflow. However, we do see technology enablers like new apps that are easier for clinicians to use. We see patient-generated data, which has some advantages and some challenges. And related to that, we see the Internet of Things. Related to outcomes measures, here at ClearDATA, we see very significant demand for big data and visualization related to some of these very topics of value-based care and outcomes that we're talking about. So there are some better tools for gathering, analyzing, and then presenting outcomes. We also do see reduced implementation connection and operating costs. The cloud has absolutely made a difference in this. I've heard that from CIOs and CTOs and other business sponsors, where they can get to more global rollout of solutions given a consistent public cloud environment. We're seeing software as a service, which is easier to maintain than having to load CDs, if you will, on premise. We see new ways like FHIR from HL7 of integrating with multiple systems, and then sharing information quickly, similar sets of tools and digital tools that allow us to get resources into the hands of caregivers. So we do see some enablers, particularly on the technology front, and even some regulatory enablers that help us address these challenges. Let's go to the next slide and even talk briefly about the regulatory backdrop. Even the federal government or regulatory agencies have seen a pressure to speed the release of drug development and medical device development. We see the 21st Century Cures Act, which was signed into law in December of 2016, and there are a number of elements in terms of funding and innovation and breakthrough therapies and priority reviews, et cetera, that have been included in the 21st Century Cures Act. We're also seeing that there was demand for further research and publication on getting into the details of how we do this. And the FDASIA report, IT report, which was really a great combination of work, joint work between the Office of the National Coordinator, the ONC, the FDA, and the FCC. They have released this report, so we do see some great regulatory developments. At the same time, I would say that we see some additional regulatory pressures. GDPR, for instance, in Europe, which is a very, very high bar related to patient privacy, that goes into effect in May of 2018, so we have less than a year. And given the fact that these platform solutions that are so important for value-based care, platforms that will surround pharmaceutical therapies, platforms that will surround medical devices, well, we are now collecting patient health information instead of de-identified information, and there's much greater scrutiny and challenge related to HIPAA, GDPR, and other global privacy standards. So while there are some regulatory advantages to us, there are, in terms of speed, there are also some regulatory headwinds. Let's look for the next slide, and this is just a quick snapshot of from a medical device perspective. The Digital Health Innovation Action Plan was just published, and don't need to go into detail, but there are some great takeaways here. We see, one, that the FDA has created very substantial international input and trying to harmonize to international standards. Again, a big benefit to us as we consider how to roll out products that are consistent globally. You'll notice the pre-certification process, this emphasis on risk stratification. So elements of the solution that have lower risk will have lower approval hurdles and will have greater speed for those components that have lower risk. We also see an emphasis here on the lower right of on real-world data collection. So we'll see further guidance. Draft guidance is expected by the end of 2017, and then the full report for public comment released in 2018. Again, an example of the changes and the innovation that the regulators are trying to support the innovation that we need. Let's turn to some use cases. And it's interesting to note that most of the use cases for value-based care are on the right end of these acronyms. So we have randomized clinical trials early on, the gold standard for clinical trials. They demonstrate clinical efficacy. We have real-world evidence starting to gain some traction, but it's really the real-world data that where the device or the therapy is living in the wild, if you will. That is where more of the payers, the sponsors, if they're looking at coverage, payment and reimbursement decisions. It's really more on that piece of it. It's these platforms that are relating to the data. The themes that we see in these use cases are absolutely collaboration. We see multiple parties having to work together instead of independently. That collaboration is leading to integration, and there's of course a significant emphasis on measurement. Let's go to the first example of a case study. And here we see a pharma innovation division developing therapies. And by the way, all of these case studies, I'm not going to mention the organization names, but these are case studies that have had press releases and speaking engagements and public presentation of this information. So I do want to be, of course, respectful of that. But this innovation division wanted to note that, particularly with antibiotics, there can be overprescription and improper prescription of those antibiotics, and then there can be a lack of adherence. And that, of course, is dangerous for the patient. It can increase the spread of antibiotic-resistant microbes, and which is dangerous for our populations. And so with this tool it is implemented into acute care settings, and gather multiple points of data and recognize which therapy should be used, and then try to encourage adherence through the full course of that antibiotic so that the bug is completely destroyed. It requires extensive use of analytics, of course needs the highest level of security and privacy and compliance, because this is protective health information, complications with multiple points of integrations, and because of the real-time nature, the portions of this were in the cloud and portions of this were on-prem. So they were able to come up with a solution that delivered this, and absolutely is bearing fruit and reducing risk for the patients, providing clinical benefit, and then in this case, actually extending the life of the drug in the market, because an antibiotic in this case would not be overprescribed. So an example where we have this information enabling medications. Let's go to the next use case. And in this case, we see pharma provider collaboration, where we have an academic medical center wanting to measure disease progression for a neurologic disease. And they were able to develop inputs from multiple devices at any location. And in this case, they wanted to move to the public cloud because they have multiple centers within the United States and Europe. But there are very, very stringent challenges related to the business associate agreement and protecting privacy, along with the ongoing compliance, all the while trying to have an agile product, a platform, if you will, that is able to continually update and respond to the learnings from the patients and the providers. So they were able to develop this system, and in this case use a public cloud platform with high levels of security to scale. And in fact, the program is now in use in both the United States and Europe. Third use case is an example related to medical devices and big data. In this case, I think you can picture that in the past, we might have an implant, and then the patient is discharged, and you get very little data in terms of the actual effectiveness of the medical device. In this case, they wanted a pilot program to have much greater granularity for every single patient with the device post-acute discharge, and this solution provided a telemetry from multiple Internet of Things, and even the device itself, all gathered in a Hadoop big data environment that then allowed case managers to provide feedback to the patient to prevent readmissions, for instance. So that if that patient needed a medication adjustment, a nurse case manager could send the patient to a physician in real time, monitoring the patient from afar. Or if the patient had a more dire issue, could direct the patient into the emergency department. And again, in this instance, there's this device. How do we make this work, both meeting the United States and Europe and other PII standards? A big challenge, but delivering big benefits. And then when we go to the next slide, wanted to just note, just very briefly, that the providers are also involved. They want to participate and help in speeding along clinical trials development, and there are needs to enable the providers to collaborate with pharma organizations and have IRB support, allow diverse stakeholders to collaborate and deliver the data and the research goals in order to speed the development of drug therapies. So we absolutely are seeing those types of initiatives of provider engagement and kind of being part of the solution as we information enable their support of clinical trial and research development. Why don't we go to the next slide, please? I think it's very common that we see risks, and the top 3 risks that we see here are organizational, technical, business. You would see that in most any project, and there are standard ways to address that, of having, from an organizational perspective, make sure we have good sponsorship and alignment and good communication, technically to have excellent project management charters, etc., business budgets and outcomes defined. I think it's the 2 rows there that we would really want to focus on, of reducing risk. I've mentioned clinically this emphasis on workflow, from all the way from conception of a platform to information enable a therapy or a device, to the prototyping and design and implementation, testing, the ongoing monitoring. We have to have workflow top of mind, and making sure that it really is as non-invasive as possible, and, if you will, take that medical dictum, the physician dictum of doing no harm, and making the design fail-safe, testing, and then, of course, auditing. And the bottom row, I think, is particularly important just because it's so different. Again, most of our efforts have been with de-identified data in the past, and value-based care is driving us to collect PII or PHI, patient health information and protected health information. So how do we mitigate that risk? Well, I mean, looking for certifications. You're going to likely have to partner with people and demanding that they have reached the highest standards of certification, driving risk to partners through contracting, making sure that they are able to step up to GDPR requirements, that they have the highest levels of cyber liability coverage, etc. Huge pressure and risk from a cybersecurity perspective, and we need to think about how we protect against those things. And then, looking for organizations that have depth of experience and focus and process maturity to support us. And then, of course, developing all of those capabilities within our own teams. Let's go to an example on the next slide. The certification and compliance perspective, that map is only getting more complicated, and this is part of ClearDATA's business. So we've tried to think about, scratch our heads, how can we simplify this for ourselves and our customers? And one of the key approaches that we have taken, that I'll share with you, is to use a certain standard as an anchor standard, and then map other certification requirements to that anchor standard. So if you make sure that you meet a certain set of requirements, in our case, we're using HITRUST, and we use HITRUST because it is the gold standard in the United States for privacy and security and compliance, and that already harmonizes many ISO and HIPAA, high-tech, and other standards. So we've got kind of a leg up if we use HITRUST as the anchor, and then we can map to all of these multiple standards you see here, including GDPR. HITRUST themselves is also now going to include things like FedRAMP support and GDPR in their version 9.1 of their standards. So that's one way to accelerate and break through this huge challenge of mapping to standards. The other thing to look at, if we can go to the next slide, is look at how do we deal with GXP complications. And we have now not just a medical device or a therapy that we need to be correct, we have to think about, well, what are the implications for this platform that may be related to the therapy or the medical device? How do we see that that platform meets not only FDA requirements in the United States, but requirements in Japan or Europe? And we essentially here, I would recommend using the same approach as the prior slide. From a privacy and security perspective, you take a certain standard, map it, and then use that as an anchor to the others. And I think it's helpful to use that same approach when we look at GxP compliance. And with that, why don't we go to the final slide? And I will summarize and see if Christy would like to open up for some questions or comments. I'm excited because I think value-based care is here. We can all see that from the polling question and the evidence in the press and our experience. It really is critical to identify and mitigate these risks, and then find the partners that are going to help you to safely share information like ShareVault does, and play the part in working to deliver higher demonstrated outcomes and lower quality costs for the benefit of all the patients and consumers. Over to you, Christy.
All right, thanks, Scott. So we do have a question over here. How does value-based care impact reimbursement?
So obviously the simple answer is we see declining reimbursement. We see, even the new MACRA legislation is going to, it's really a zero-sum game. If somebody meets the standards, they may get, some upside, but that upside is going to be taken away from someone else. So it is competitive in that, that you have to be better than the other person in order to either maintain or increase your reimbursement.
Great. All right, the next question. What should be considered when engaging in value-based contracting and shared risk models?
So for shared risk models, I do like to look at gain sharing. I think it's important when you're doing a shared risk model to look at how can there be a win for you and a win for you. So not just arm wrestling over who's going to lose in this model. And so if you can think about aligning incentives, also thinking about sharing information to think, well, here's some transparency on my cost drivers. Can you help me here? Or can you help me there? I think those are some examples I have personally seen when I have engaged in some of these risk-based solutions. That those are a couple of principles that have help the process win and help it again ultimately benefit patients and providers while protecting the constituents who have to do the cost savings.
Great. And one last question for you, Scott. What should organizations consider before applying a value-based care model to a drug program?
Wow. So I think I've highlighted a few of those things. And, there are, how do we think about workflow? What is it going to take if we're going to be actually adding information tools? And really make sure that they're, from a business perspective, we can demonstrate business value. We can collect the metrics that we need. We can demonstrate that we can reduce cost. And then, of course, this issue of our exposure from a compliance, privacy, security perspective. We are entering into new territory. Make sure that you engage folks on your team that can address the challenges that come with collecting and sharing and storing and analyzing protected health information.
Great. And here's one last question for you, Scott, before we wrap it up. How are issues with the inconsistency in our present political/government environments going to affect VBC in the near future and in the long term?
Wow, I love that question. And I've been talking with some colleagues, executives in the field about this very question just last week at a big national conference. Was on a panel, had this very question. And I think that the quick answer is that value-based care, the ship has sailed. It's happening. The trend is going. We, employer groups, regardless of what the federal government does, employer groups and individuals are going to drive, they are demanding higher quality and they are demanding lower costs. That's happening. There is some noise. Well, still, the federal government is the largest payer, so what they do makes a difference. But there has been bipartisan support for continuation and likely expansion of value-based care programs. So even with the uncertainty from a regulatory, or pardon me, from a legislative perspective, I think you must expect that there's going to be increased value-based care.
All right. Well, that does it for today. Thank you so much to Scott. Thank you for everyone who attended, and thank you to ShareVault for partnering with us. We hope everybody has a great day. We will make this webinar available to you on demand on our website. So please refer back to ClearDATA.com if you would like to review this session. Thanks and have a great day.